Good morning, thank you for joining us today on this CAB webinar. Today we are looking at access and the use of dwellings, which is Building Regulations Part M. My name is Katie Di Stefano. I'm the administrator here for the digital side of the business, and I'll be looking after you with any questions and queries that you have throughout the course of this webinar. We operate an interactive seminar, so you can send any questions and comments to us using the question panel, which is on the dashboard on the right-hand side of your screen. You can send any questions through, and what we'll do is do our best to answer them as we go along throughout the session, or we'll either answer them at the end. If you do send anything through that's quite specific, what we'll try and do is perhaps come back to you separately after the actual event. If you're on Twitter, we have a hashtag CABECPD. Your presenter today is Kevin Blunden. He's the Deputy Chief Executive for CABE on the technical side, and he's actually this morning in Scotland. He's representing CABE at Scotland Build, where he's chairing all the seminar sessions today in the main hall. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Kevin, who will talk you through this morning's presentation.
Right, just sorting out some of the bits and pieces so as you can see what I've got in front of me, and then we can obviously move on. Right, what I'm hoping to do today is use through the changes that have occurred recently to Part M of the building regulations in England relating to domestic properties. I'm not on all the documents paragraph. So highlight some that you'll need to consider. Some of the little words that are in there, things that you might decide to need your attention. A little bit of background. You'll probably be aware that the government was on a policy of rationalising housing standards and reducing the wide range of standards that applied across the construction sector, predominantly through the planning regime. Now, in relation to access, that was primarily an issue in relation to local requirements for things like lifetime homes or wheelchair accessible properties that then imposed locally as part of planning conditions something over and above the building regulations. And so to try and get some consistency in place and understand what's actually going on, then the housing standards is basically free level access the department. But you know, the questions looks orange. Okay, I'm going to assume that everything's working reasonably well. Okay. So, having some presentation, just within 1 second, we'll try and go on.
Just dropping in here just to say I'm noting that we are having a few problems with the connection, Kevin. Can I suggest, Kevin, can you just switch off your webcam to see if that increases the speed of the transfer, just so we can hear your voice just a bit better? There we go.
Dropped off the webcam. Hopefully you can see. Can you tell me, Katie, if you can actually see the presentation?
I can, yes. Would you just mind, that seems to sound a bit better, if you wouldn't mind just dropping back a little bit and kind of almost starting again. Sorry for the inconvenience, everybody, but thank you for bearing with us.
Yeah, not a problem. Okay, sorry about that. Hopefully you can hear me a little bit better now.
Sounds great.
So yes, to set the scene today, looking at Part M, access to dwellings, The National Housing Standards were rationalised up until the early part of this year. Planning authorities could ask for a range of standards and set their own particular standards in terms of access. So there was a range of guidance that they could be looking at, things like lifetime homes or wheelchair accessible homes, and individual planning authorities would do a viability test and determine what standard they were going to apply in their area. The government took the view that this wasn't particularly good for developers or designers who needed some consistency. So as a result, we have 3 different standards of access that can be chosen that are enforced through the building regulations but selected by the planning process. In looking at it from a planning point of view, local planning authorities now have to consider what level of access they require and make it part of their local plan. And if their local plan isn't due for revision just at the moment, they have to update it to the new housing standards based on equivalence of what they were already looking for. So they have to consider if the higher standards of access are required in their particular area or in particular developments. And that means that they need to gather evidence to demonstrate there is a need and to apply viability costing to make sure that it's actually reasonable to expect somebody to be achieving this standard. So it is quite a thorough process. The framework for that is already in the National Planning Policy Framework. And in reality, it does mean that we're now going to have 3 different standards, but at least we have some parameters to work to. And what it also means from a planning point of view is they cannot ask for any other standard other than that was in the building regulations. Now, I believe one of the areas where this may cause some confusion will be around what's being selected, because the access standards are being delivered through Part M of the building regulations. The planning authority will determine which standard is applicable, but in selecting a standard, what they will be determining is which of the 3 building regulations in Part M applies. They may have the perception that what they're going to get as a finished product is what you find in approved document M. But as with all approved documents to the building regulations, the approved document is only one way of demonstrating compliance. So if a developer or a designer can persuade building control that actually there's an alternative solution that achieves the same end result, then that may be acceptable in terms of building regulations and will therefore achieve compliance with the planning condition. So it won't necessarily be the case that we always see exactly what's in the approved document. So the standard we've really got is a standard which is very similar, apart from a couple of minor details, to the current standard or the previous standard under Part M, which is about visibility of the dwellings, gaining access to the entrance level, and being able to use a toilet facility at that level. The second level then sits in is to deliver accessible and adaptable housing to meet the needs of some older people and some disabled people, and this is primarily aimed at being able to keep people supported in their own home rather than forcing them to move because of their ability. And finally, there's the higher level, which is wheelchair user housing, and it does split down into designs for wheelchair users and designs for wheelchair adaptable premises. So that's the basic standards that we're looking at that are now detailed within approved document M. As a result of the changes, we have a new Part M guidance document that deals specifically with dwellings. It's in the new format that we're seeing with building regulations and relies quite heavily on diagrams to reinforce the written text. There is also now then a new Part M for buildings other than dwellings. There have been no technical changes. All that really is the previous Part M with all of the references to dwellings taken out of it. Now, if you did download or work with a very early copy of Part M when it was initially published online, there were some errors within that in terms of some of the drawings and some of the dimensional stuff, so you will need to make sure you're dealing with the most up-to-date copy. So we have visitable dwellings, accessible and adaptable dwellings, and wheelchair user dwellings. And these are the categories that will be determined through the planning permission. So it will become a planning condition as to which category is required for a development or an individual plot. And then the developer will have to build that, building control will enforce to it. As far as concerned, they are termed optional requirements, and it is only an option for the planning department. It's not, unfortunately, an option for the developer or the designer, but they are one of several parts of the regulations now where we have differing standards that are determined through the optional approach. What it does mean, though, is if you are building something like a sheltered housing development or a block of flats, and you've got shared or common approach routes serving several dwellings, then that approach route has to be designed for the most onerous case. So if you've got a common route that's serving some category 1 dwellings, some category 2 and some category 3, it has to be designed to category 3 for the parts that lead to the category 3 dwellings. So therefore, our common routes around developments may need a little bit more attention, and particularly when we get to category 2 and category 3, there are additional routes to things like garden areas, to refuse storage, that actually now require a level of accessibility, some minimum widths and minimum gradients, so that we can make sure that people can live and use their properties effectively. One of the strange quirks in the way the legislation has been set up is that it's actually the person carrying out the work who must notify building control which optional requirement is being used. Now, I would suggest to anybody who's doing the building control process that they look to see a copy of the planning permission and any conditions attached to it, so that actually it's possible then to be absolutely sure which standards being enforced. There's been nothing worse than getting to the end of the project and then determining that actually we haven't managed to achieve the right standard. So the regulations are drafted in 3 different regulations, M4 1, 2 and 3. And they all have the same basic requirement. And the requirement is really reasonable provision should be made for people to gain access and to use the dwelling and its facilities. That's the basic requirement. And then with M4.2 and M4.3, there are some additional requirements based upon the type of people that we're trying to achieve that access for. That is the requirement that planning are asking for in their condition. What they're looking for is compliance with that regulation. And because, as in with all building regulations, it uses terminology like reasonable provision, it is open to interpretation. It is the case that obviously if people design to the guidance in the approved document, it is deemed to have met that requirement, but at the same time, there is scope for somebody to be able to demonstrate that they've used an alternative approach that achieves the same end solution. Now, all of this obviously is based in the theoretical world, and the way the legislation is drafted is very much the theoretical world, where people submit their application for planning, get that approved with their conditions, then think about submitting their application for building regulations, and as a result, there's a nice flowing process. In the real world, quite often the building regulation consent will have been sought before planning and permission is granted, and therefore building control and the designer won't necessarily know what standard they are designing to. There is provision that once somebody knows what the planning condition is, it then has to be notified to building control, but you have to take an approach that means that should a higher level be required, it's got to be revisited. So in terms of what is a reasonable provision for access, in general terms, it's getting from the curtilage of the dwelling, or if you're dealing with a site with multiple dwellings, from the perimeter of the site to the dwelling. Looking at the point where you're most likely to turn up as a visitor, where you're getting out of a car, and where an ambulance disabled person might want to visit the dwellings. So we have to be able to get into that entrance level, access habitable rooms and the WC. We need ideally to have step-free access between the habitable rooms and the WC on entrance level. And then there are some requirements to wall-mounted switches and sockets to make sure that people with reduced reach can address them. And it's that area where there's one subtle change in the guidance. The approved document, Part B, does actually talk about accessible thresholds, and it does actually refer to another piece of guidance that was introduced 16 years ago when we first started addressing this in the building regs, which was the accessible thresholds in new housing guidance for house builders and developers. I must be honest, I've looked online for this document and I'm unable to actually find a copy that's still available. Having said that, we have successfully been building level thresholds now for 16 years, so I don't think it's necessarily the challenge it was when it was first introduced. What we will find in some of the categories of dwellings, particularly category 2, category 3, that we might also be looking for accessible thresholds to back doors, to other access rather than just to the front door of the property. In terms of the services and controls bit, the other bit that's slightly different from what we see at the moment is in relation to the consumer units. Consumer units now are required to be mounted with the switches at somewhere between 1350 and 1450 above floor level. Now, if you think at the majority of domestic properties, the box of the micro switches usually sits up over the front door or to one side of the front door at high level. This dimension, 1350, 1450, is significantly lower than we would expect to see. It's also higher than maybe you would get if you're putting it in an understair cupboard or something of that sort. So in reality, that is a subtle change going forward. And it's a balance between, can somebody with reduced reach actually reach the switches, against what are we doing to make sure that children and young people can't start playing with these things. And that's a recurring theme through all three standards for access. So that's it. There's not a lot else that's changed in relation to visitable dwellings. It's very much the standard we've been used to for a decade or so. The category 2 is about accessible and adaptable buildings. So we stand off with the same requirement about access and to use the facilities. The different bit here is that it's got to be sufficient to meet the needs of occupants with differing needs, including some older or disabled people. Now, to be honest, that's a very broad statement, because to meet the needs of occupants with differing needs could be absolutely anything. But generally what we're looking at is a standard of a property that provides a reasonable level of access to start with, but has built in at the construction stage of the original building some features that will allow future adaptation without major structural alteration and change. So it is intended to allow people to stay put in their property for quite a long while. The information about limits on the application are really just saying that you only apply regulation 2 where you don't apply regulation 1 or 3. So very similar information. Slightly different pictures and graphs in the approved document. This is the graph that deals with ramps. Rather than just have a table telling you what gradient the ramp is, what we've got here is a graphical representation, and you've got the gradient of the ramp up one side, the maximum length of the ramp across the bottom, and anything that would fall within the grey shaded area would not be acceptable in terms of the gradient of a ramp. So we couldn't, for instance, have a 3 metre long 1 in 12 ramp. It's just a different way of perhaps presenting the information. And then we get to information about doors and communal entrances. When the document takes the approach all the way through that we will look at communal entrances where we maybe got a block of flats, and then also at the private entrance, and there are slightly different requirements for the two. But there is also some slightly different terminology creeping in. There's some slightly different requirements sitting there. I think we've all got used to the 300mm nib to the leading edge of a door to allow somebody to sit in a wheelchair and be able to open the door without having to reverse back at the same time. But what the guidance is also recognising now is, as external walls have got thicker and thicker and thicker to improve insulation standards, depending on where we put the frame in that recess can actually mean that it can be quite difficult to reach the door handle. So we're now saying there's a maximum 200mm reveal that the door can be set into the wall construction. There's also a new term being introduced, which is the following edge of the door. So we've got used to the leading edge, we've now got the following edge, and in some doors, in some circumstances, particularly category 3, we need minimum dimensions on the following edge as well as the leading edge. One of the things we do have to allow for in our category 2 adaptable properties is to allow for the future provision of a stair lift. So we have to allow for a stair lift to be fitted from the entrance story to the story above without requiring a future structural alteration, which really means that that wall that runs alongside the stairs has got to be capable of taking the rail, or the stair itself will have to support the rail. It also means that we need a minimum width of the staircase of 850 millimeters, so that if we do fit the stair lift, we've still got a decent residual width of stairs there. And in addition, we also need to look at whether we've got a suitable power supply in the right location to fit the stair lift later on. One of the more controversial areas that appears in the documents now is in relation to spatial requirements. There are several diagrams and several bits of information about how big things like bedrooms have to be. So we're looking at a zone of 750 wide from the door of a bedroom to the window of the bedroom so that we can circulate round. We're also looking at space to the side or to the foot of the bed. That varies depending on whether it's the main bedroom, whether it's a double bedroom, whether it's a single bedroom, but we're looking at some clear spatial requirements. And to support those spatial requirements, the approved document has introduced some standard furnishing sizes. So from this diagram, you can see that there's a bed with some space. There's also down towards the bottom left-hand side a wardrobe that's behind some of the notes. And space has to be clear of the furniture. So the designer now is going to have to populate the drawing with standard specification furniture from the appendix in the approved document to demonstrate that these spaces are achieved. And then sanctuary fittings. We have to make sure that if we put a WC and a sanctuary accommodation in, that we can later adapt it by putting in things like grab rails without needing to do structural alteration. So that means that the walls have to be suitable to carry the load of a grab rail of around about 1.5 kilonewtons a square metre. Now, with the best will in the world, dry lining plasterboard plugs will not take that load. So it probably means that these facilities are going to have to be lined out with ply to be able to allow for the future fitting of grab rails. Okay. Before I move on to Regulation 3, I'm just going to try and pick up on some of the questions that seem to be coming in. I don't know if you picked up any common themes. I mean, I've got to be honest, it's quite manic for Katie to manage this today because there have been quite a lot of comments about the sound quality and the like. But I'm just trying to see if there's anything technical.
Kevin, point you to the question that's come in from Rob Gary with regard to what you were just talking about with the dimensions, and it's about the door swing. Does that need to be outside the 750 mil zone that you were talking about specifying in the room?
No, if I just drop back a couple of slides to the one on the bedroom, which is an extract from the approved document, the 750 millimeters zone of space around the bedroom doesn't have to be clear of the door swing. So the door swing can be over that. Similarly, if you've got a wardrobe doors can be over that. Dressing table drawers can be over that. Anything that can be shut is fine, but you do need to keep it clear, or there needs to be a space there when the door is shut. So no, it doesn't include the door swing. When you look at category 3, the spatial stuff gets bigger, and there are some additional requirements there, but that's generally where we are. Okay, I think most of the other bits and pieces have probably been covered off. Okay, there is just one question there that's coming from Karen, just saying what dimension is 600 mil. Could you just clarify exactly what it is you're looking for there? And then I'll try and pick up on that one. Okay. Right, category 3 properties then. So category 3 is the most onerous classification. It isn't anticipated that this will be used in a lot of cases because it is for wheelchair user dwellings. And generally we're looking at properties that are designed specifically for wheelchair users, or properties that will allow use by a wheelchair user with fairly simple adaptation. Some of the document gives options for which of these are, and it has to be fairly clear which one you're trying to look at. Okay. So what do we find in here? We start looking at things like car parking spaces, an actual standard parking bay, 2.4 meters wide, 4.8 meters long, with a 1.2 meter zone all the way around it, and with a headroom of 2.2 so that we can open the tailgate. So that tends to be the standard we're looking for when we start getting into category 3. When we get to communal entrances, we're also looking at the normal sort of things like the 300mm nib to the leading edge, but on a communal entrance, if the opening force of the door is more than 20 newtons, it needs a power-assisted opening device. We need a lobby inside the door to allow for manoeuvrability. We also need a 200mm nib to the following edge of the door, and both of those nibs should extend 1800mm beyond the door. So it's getting to be spatially quite complicated. We also have differing requirements depending on whether it's a communal entrance or the private entrance to the dwelling, in terms of things like the size of the landing, the lighting that's needed there, shelter and roofs over it. So for instance, a private entrance in a category 3, we need a landing that's 1500 by 1500 clear of the door swings, and 1200 by 1200 of that landing needs to be covered with a roof so that you can sit there at least partially in the dry. You're looking at lighting that's activated by daylight or movement. You also need yet another nib to the door, this time on the hinge side of the door, of 150mm, so that you can put a cage on the back of the letterbox and that doesn't restrict the opening of the door. The logic being there, obviously, that somebody in a wheelchair wouldn't necessarily be able to bend down to the floor to pick the mail up if it just fell onto the floor. And on the private dwelling, it's not essential to fit the power assist opening device straight from the beginning, but it is essential to have a power supply there so that it can be fitted relatively easily later on. So a lot of this will require the designer to indicate at application stage how the property can be adapted later. Right, we also will need wheelchair storage space. So space for storing 2 wheelchairs. The space is 1700 by 1100, but it needs a space alongside it of 1200mm to allow it to transfer. And it needs a power socket so that they can be stored. Now obviously not everybody is going to need this from day one, so this space can be used for something else initially, as long as it can be turned into a wheelchair storage space once the need is there, which does mean that this can't count to some of the minimum floor areas that we need for living space or storage, because obviously once it's been converted to wheelchair it can't contribute to those. So one of the big things that we do have to include in category 3 is provision through a through floor lift. So you need to be able to make provision at day 1 for the future fitting of a through floor lift. That means that the floor shouldn't need subsequent structural alteration. So the floor will have to be trimmed round to allow for the lift from day 1. Relatively easy if it's timber floor. The size requirements for the lift mean that actually being 1100 by 1650, it's a little bit more problematic if maybe you're using a beam and block floor, but you need to have the ability to take bit of the floor away to put the lift in without making structural alteration. You also need the walls there that will support the lift at a later date. And unlike maybe through floor lifts that we fit into existing properties as a retrofit situation, there is a requirement that the lift will circulate between hallways or circulation spaces. Obviously when we retrofit we tend to put them between a lounge and a bedroom, but this would have to retrofit between the circulation spaces. The walls, as I say, would have to be able to support it, and the drawings have to show how this liftway is going to be accommodated later on. Okay, and again, this space could be used for something else initially, but not something that contributes to minimum spatial areas. So we do have to try and make sure that we've covered all of that to allow us to fit the lift later on in a fairly easy manner. I'm just going to pick up on a couple of couple of bits and pieces. Where are we? The letterbox cage, the letterboxes have to be a certain height. No, they don't have to be a particularly certain height. There is a requirement under Part Q now for security about the actual size of the letterbox itself, but nothing about the particular height of it. And is there a height restriction on the wheelchair storage, i.e. understairs or downstairs? I'm not entirely sure that there is a height restriction in the approved document, to be perfectly honest. That's an interesting question. I'll look into it, and if it's anything different, we'll post it online as an answer, but I don't believe there is a height restriction. But obviously it needs to be practical enough that you can transfer. Right. So the through floor lift itself, 1100 by 1650, it has to have a 1500 clear turning circle outside it. And although the corridor widths in the dwelling can be narrower than that, there are quite a few situations, particularly in category 3, where we need 1500 millimeter turning circles. So actually most of the corridors are going to end up being 1500 wide, just from a practical point of view. In addition to the making provision to cut the floor and support the walls, obviously we still need to put in the power supply from day one in case we want to fit this lift later on. Having made provision for a lift, we still have to do what we did for category 2, and we still have to allow for a stair lift as well in exactly the same way. So it's not one or the other. The user may choose to have a stair lift as opposed to a through floor lift, and therefore there has to be provision in there for that as well. When it gets to things like kitchens, there are some requirements for minimum lengths of worktops. So depending on how many bed spaces there are in the property, we have a minimum combined length of kitchen worktop. That changes depending on whether we're looking at a wheelchair accessible dwelling or a wheelchair adaptable dwelling. But we also need something like 2.2 meters long bit of worktop, which includes the drainer and the hob and the sink, and that piece of worktop can't have any white goods or cupboards underneath it so that people can get a leg space underneath. You have to insulate the underside of the sink so that it's usable later on. And then a much bigger requirement in terms of the bedroom. In addition to what we saw for category 2, now we've got a metre wide space around the main bed in the principal bedroom, and we've also got at least 2 spaces, one each side, that are 1200 by 1200 for manoeuvrability. Now they are clear of things like wardrobes, chest of drawers, and all of those bits of furniture sizes are at the back of the approved document in the appendix. So we're ending up something there in terms of that room of something that's going to be round about 3.94 meters wide as a bare minimum. So it does become quite onerous in terms of this standard. And then bedrooms. Ideally, the main bedrooms should be close to a bathroom that's accessible, particularly in terms of the main principal bedroom. All of the other bedrooms should be accessible to wheelchair users. They still need this 750 wide route from the door to the window, the manoeuvring space. But critically, every bedroom needs to have a ceiling capable of supporting a hoist that will lift 200 kilograms. Now, this doesn't have to be a tracking hoist that will take people from the bedroom to the bathroom, down the corridor or whatever. It's just a local hoist. But again, this is something that's going to change the basic construction, because a standard truss rafter roof will not take this sort of loading. And as I say, this applies to every bedroom. Similarly with the sanitary facilities, that ceiling has to be able to carry the same sort of hoist. Our ductwork, our boxing, our walls still have to be able to take the grab rails. And then depending on the size of the property, the number of bed spaces, number of stories, we have differing requirements. But basically every room that has an installed level access shower should be constructed as a wet room, and any dwelling with 4 or more bed spaces needs at least 2 WCs. So it does tend to start having a knock-on effect in terms of sizes. Right, I'm going to try and go back and pick up a few more of the questions. Can the wheelchair storage be outside? The implication of the approved document is that that wheelchair storage is inside because it's a traditional electric wheelchair that you're moving around in. There is also reference in the approved document to charging points externally, maybe for mobility scooters. So the implication is that this is internal. Yes, you're quite right. Somebody's picked up that I'm talking about a 750 metre clear access route, but also talking about a meter in the diagram. The diagram is the principal bedroom, the biggest bedroom. Other bedrooms need the 750 millimetres, so it's still there. So if you've got a 4-bedroom house, there is an assumption in this that the end user may choose to use any of those bedrooms as being the one that somebody with a particular need chooses to use. Right. Do you think we'll be able to use statements in mitigation where full compliance cannot be shown? This is going to be a very difficult issue because obviously the standard itself is being driven by the Planning Commission. There's an expectation of what will be achieved, but we have to achieve, as far as the regulation is concerned, what's reasonable. So the question is there, can we demonstrate something that's reasonable? The difficulty is that we are talking about a property that's being designed now considering its future use. So even if you had a statement in mitigation from the incoming owner or tenant, there's no guarantee that 5 to 10 years down the line it wouldn't be somebody else that's in that property who would have different needs, and therefore we still have to have the ability to adapt the properties. So I don't think statements in mitigation will be acceptable. In terms of the size, somebody's asking what's the assumed size of a double bed. In the appendix, the back of the appendix D, it does give the size of a double bed in a principal bedroom, the main bedroom, and on other double bedrooms. And basically, the size in the principal bedroom is taken as being roughly a key size, which is 1,500 meters by 2 meters, I think, in the specification. And other double beds are slightly smaller, but all of that is listed at the back of the document. So as a designer, you have to use those sizes of furniture to demonstrate the size of the room. Obviously, when it comes to building control, checking the job on completion, the furniture won't be in, but the design will have dictated the overall size of the room. So that's what will have to be assessed and checked. In terms of entrance doors having a force of less than 20 newtons, it is a requirement for the common areas that if it's more than 20 newtons, it has to power assist. The requirement for the individual property door is just that there's the ability to switch on. It's not restricted to newtons. So maybe if the user needs a power assist for a door that requires significantly less, it still has to be there. So there still has to be the ability to fit a power assist later on. Okay. Right, how do you envisage local authorities will be aware of the requirements regarding disabled provisions? There is at the moment quite an education process going on with planning authorities. I think it would be fair to say it is lagging behind somewhat because there have been a lot of other changes in the planning arena as well. But there is a lot being done to educate. There's a lot of circulars and ministerial statements coming out to guide planning authorities, and it is something they are going to get on board with, but it will take them a little while to move from existing local plans to updated local plans. What they do have to do now is if the existing local plan asks for something different like lifetime homes, then they have to port that across to the equivalent standard in Part M, so that would be level 2. Okay. Minimum wheelchair turning area and what will clash with the meter at the side of the bed. In terms of the principal bedroom, the minimum turning area is that 1200 by 1200 circulation space. Maneuvering space. Elsewhere in the diagrams in the document, it tends to talk about a 1500 millimeter turning circle. Okay. Do 3-story dwellings require a lift? No, we're only talking about from ground floor to first floor. The implication being that you could put a bedroom on the first floor. You don't have to have the stair lift or the through-floor lift that will go up 3 stories. Right. Is it not the case that larger sites will require a mix? Yes, there certainly will be a mix, and the difficulty will be that if planning are looking to just say, well, we want 10% of this site to be level 2, how does that relate to actually which particular plots we're looking at? And it is one of those things that it's much easier to look at level 2 and level 3 in maybe the social housing sector or in the letting sector than it maybe is in the speculative private purchase sector, where obviously you don't necessarily always match the user to the particular property that you design. So you could design a category 2 property and actually the people who come and use it don't actually want that facility, but somebody else who does wants a different plot. So that's always going to be a bit of an issue. But as I say, planning has to go through this viability testing. Right, moving on. In addition then, some of the work we have to do under category 3 to routes to gardens, balconies, roof terraces have to now be accessible routes. So they have to have minimum widths, they have to have suitable gradients, they have to have suitable drainage under Part H of the building regulations, so that we can make sure that people can get to their facilities. And there isn't a misprint on the third paragraph on this slide. This is actually from the approved document that says that for category 3 wheelchair user properties, people have to have an access route to their cycle store. I'm not entirely sure why somebody in the wheelchair is trying to get to the cycle store, but they have to be able to get there. So it is quite onerous in terms of what we're doing outside the property as well when we get to category 3. And as I said, because of that, I think category 3 will be very few and far between, because to actually demonstrate the need and the viability testing that this is cost effective will be quite a significant issue. And therefore I think we won't see very many category 3 properties because they are actually much more user specific. Right. Okay, so I'm trying now to pick up on any other questions that are kicking around. Katie, have you picked up any questions that I've missed?
To be honest, Kevin, no. Very well in terms of incorporating all the questions into the actual presentations we've gone along. There are a few now starting to drop in if you want to have a quick look at the question pane. So I would just say to everyone, if you have got any questions on the presentation this morning, now's your time to quickly type them over to us and we will answer them for you.
Yeah, that's fine. So one that's just popped in there, what about regulation B1 and means of escape? I suppose that the issue is once we've got people upstairs using a stair lift or a through floor lift, our normal strategy for escaping from the first floor, jumping out the window, probably isn't appropriate. As with a lot of things in building regulations, there is no real joined up thinking. So there is no additional knock-on effect of that. And similarly, there's nothing that's really then saying, well, what if we've actually got fire doors and a protected staircase in the property? How's that related? We have to try as far as possible to meet the requirements of both parts of the regulations, but it could potentially mean that we have a domestic dwelling where we've got people upstairs using a lift. If it was a commercial building, we'd be looking at some alternative way of getting them out. It will really fall down to the householder and their own plan of how they're going to get out of the property. What happens post-completion where people want to simply redesign a bathroom layout? It will depend on whether this is a material alteration or not. It's a tricky one, because theoretically, if the layout was such in terms of the spatial arrangements, you could argue that after the work, it's complying to a lesser extent than it was before. But I don't actually believe it still will constitute building work as such if somebody's just moving the position of a bath or a shower. One of the things I haven't shown in the slides is in category 2 and category 3, there's a lot of reference to providing a WC that's big enough to have a level access shower, that in the meantime you may put something else in its place, or you may put a bath in its place and change to a level access shower later on. And that needs that adaptability as well in terms of drainage and the like. How many councils have done the needs assessment for their planning process? To be fair, a lot of planning authorities have been asking for further guidance from the government on how to do the viability testing, how to make these decisions. The government's answer so far has been actually this viability testing is no different than they should have been doing if they were looking for lifetime homes or wheelchair accessible properties. So the principles are there under the National Planning Policy Framework. They should just be applying them in the same way. I do think to a certain extent a lot of planning authorities will err on the side of caution, because I suspect there will be a lot of appeals if too onerous conditions are being imposed. Are there any implications for domestic waste disposal in category 3? No, nothing's been joined up there instead. Obviously Part H was adapted this year to refer to some NHBC Foundation guidance on waste collection and waste disposal, but there's nothing that's specific in terms of category 3 properties. At the moment, yes, this does only apply in England, but I believe there is a rollout program. I'm not entirely sure on the overall rollout for that. A couple of people have asked about the presentation itself. As with all of these, once it's finished today, the presentation will, as a recording of this event, go onto our YouTube channel, so you'll be able to revisit it. Other staff will be able to look at it. Hopefully it'll hear me talking from underneath the swimming pool, and it'll include all the errors and everything else, but hopefully at some stage it will make some sense. Okay, I think that's covered off most of the questions. Obviously, if there is anything else, please feel free to drop me an email at some point and I will try and respond to your queries. Okay, back to you then, Katie.
Kevin, can I just point, there's just another one just popped in. I didn't know if you just wanted to pick that one up from Anthony just before we finish.
Am I correct that LA Building Control can carry on with follow-up inspections to sites to check compliance is achieved, and can charges be applied? It will be whichever building control body is dealing with the project. So if it's an approved inspector or local authority building control, they will be looking at the project and they will be determining compliance. There is no implication that the local authority will then be visiting it either from a planning perspective or from building control to double check that it complies. Once building control have signed it off as being compliant, that in effect is enough to clear the planning condition. And should the lift have a protected supply in terms of fire, there's no requirement for that in the approved document.
Okay, lovely.
Okay.
Thank you, Kevin. Would like to thank you all this morning for joining us. We are not running a webinar next month, being December, and Webinar Wednesday will return in January. We've published the next 6 months worth of webinars. They're available on our website. If you pop over to cbuildE.com/events and search for webinars, they're all there listed for you, so we hope that you can join us again throughout those. But again, thank you very much for joining us this morning. Thank you for all the questions. It's been a really good interactive session. Apologies for the issues at the very beginning with the sound, but we did resolve those and we hope that it didn't spoil the presentation too much for you. So again, thank you for joining us and we will see you online again soon. Bye-bye.